My left knee had been acting up again that morning. I remember standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing out my coffee mug, watching the neighbor's dog sniff around the hydrangeas my wife planted 23 years ago. She's been gone 11 years now. The hydrangeas still come back every June. I don't know why I keep them. Maybe I do know. My son called at 8:15. Not to check on me. He never calls to check on me. He called because he needed the Wi-Fi password for the guest room where he and my daughter-in-law had been staying for the past 3 weeks, while the renovations on their place finished up. That's what he said in the beginning. 3 weeks had turned into 2 months. I gave him the password. He hung up without saying thank you. I stood there holding the mug and I thought, this is how it starts. Let me back up. My son is 44 years old. His name is Preston. I named him after my father, who was a hard man but a fair one. I don't know where I went wrong or if I went wrong at all, but Preston turned out to be a different kind of man than my father was, smoother, more careful about appearances. He married a woman named Laurel about 12 years ago. Laurel is attractive and well-dressed, and she has never once looked me in the eye for longer than 3 seconds. At family dinners, she talks about her Pilates studio and the couples they vacation with, and I nod and pass the bread. They have one daughter, Poppy. She's 9. She has her grandmother's eyes, and she still thinks I hung the moon, which is the only reason I have never said the things out loud that I am about to write down. When Preston first suggested they stay with me temporarily, I said yes because of Poppy. She padded around my house in her socks and asked me to show her how to use the record player, and we spent a Saturday afternoon listening to Chet Baker while she drew horses in a sketchbook. I thought, this is fine, this is good even. But Laurel started making comments around week 3, little ones. The kind that are designed to sound like observations. You know, Dad, this kitchen layout is really inefficient. Have you thought about opening it up? The guest bathroom is so cramped. It must be hard to keep clean at your age. Preston and I were talking. This neighborhood has really changed. The property values here have gone up so much. It's almost a shame to have all this equity just sitting. I let it go. I'm 67 years old. I've been letting things go since before she was born. Then one Tuesday I came home from my cardiologist appointment. Routine, nothing dramatic, just the quarterly check they do when you've got a stent. And I heard them talking in the dining room. The door was half open. I wasn't trying to listen. I was taking off my jacket in the hallway and Laurel's voice carried. The realtor said comparable homes in this zip code are going for between $850 and $920. If we list in the spring, we'd have to handle him carefully, Preston said. He's reasonable when he thinks it's his idea. I stood very still. The memory care facility on Dunmore Road has a nice reputation, Laurel said. Dr. Weston mentioned it when we ran into him at the club. He said the waiting list isn't as long as it used to be. He's not ready for that. He will be. I hung up my jacket. I went into the den and I turned on the baseball game, and I sat there for 4 innings without seeing a single pitch. I was not confused. I want to be clear about that. I was not panicking and I was not misreading anything. I am a retired civil engineer. I spent 31 years building bridges that had to hold. I know the difference between a crack in the surface and a crack in the foundation. What I had just heard was a crack in the foundation. I didn't say anything that night, or the next day. I have learned in 67 years that the worst thing you can do when someone underestimates you is correct them immediately. You let them keep underestimating you. You use it. I called my attorney the next morning from my car, parked 2 blocks away. His name is not important. What matters is that he has handled my affairs for 19 years, and he is not the kind of man who gets excited easily. When I told him what I'd heard, he was quiet for a moment. Is the house solely in your name? He asked. Always has been. And your accounts? Mine? I never added anyone. Good, he said. Let's keep it that way. Come in Thursday and we'll talk about next steps. I drove home. I made dinner. I let Poppy beat me at cards. Laurel complimented my pot roast in a voice that made it sound like a minor miracle that I'd managed it. I smiled and said, "Thank you." Thursday came. I told Preston I had a follow-up, the cardiologist, and asked if he could pick Poppy up from school. He said yes, distracted, barely looking up from his laptop. I drove to my attorney's office on the other side of town. We talked for 2 hours. I had options, my attorney explained. More options than I probably realized because I had been, without knowing it, doing everything right for years. The house was mine, free and clear, paid off in 2019. My retirement accounts had named beneficiaries. My granddaughter, with a trust structure I'd set up years ago on a whim, really, after my wife died. My investment accounts were similarly protected. What Preston and Laura were planning, whatever version of it they were planning, required either my cooperation or my incapacitation. Since I was neither cooperating nor incapacitated, they had almost nothing. Almost. The problem was the power of attorney document I'd signed 7 years ago. My attorney pulled it out and walked me through it carefully. It was a standard, durable POA, and I had named Preston as my agent. At the time, it seemed like the sensible, responsible thing. He was my only child. His mother was already gone. Who else? This gives him significant authority if a physician certifies cognitive impairment, my attorney said. Can I revoke it? Today, if you want. I signed the revocation before I left. On the way home, I stopped at the hardware store and bought 2 new deadbolt locks. One for the study where I keep my filing cabinet. One for the door to the detached garage where my late wife's jewelry and a few other valuables were stored in a lockbox I'd never mentioned to anyone. I want to tell you about something that happened that weekend, because it changed my thinking about the timeline. Poppy had a soccer game Saturday morning. I went because I go to every game she'll let me attend, which so far has been all of them. Laurel usually stands with the other parents near the far goal. Preston checks his phone on the sideline. I bring a folding chair and a thermos of coffee, and I watch the whole thing like it's the World Cup, because for me it is. After the game, Poppy ran over to me instead of her parents. She was sweaty and her ponytail had come half undone, and she grabbed my hand and said, "Grandpa, did you see my goal?" I had seen it. A clean strike from just inside the box, which shocked her coach and most of her teammates. She is not a natural athlete. She has her grandmother's stubbornness and my slow feet, but she practices in the backyard 3 times a week, and that matters more than talent, always. I saw every second of it, I told her. She leaned against my arm and said, "Mom says we're going to be moving soon. To a new house. Is that your house?" I looked at her. "Your house," she said. She said it might become our house. I kept my voice even. "Your mum said that." Poppy nodded. She had already moved on, pointing at a friend across the field. "Can I have a hot chocolate after? The stand's still open." "Of course you can." I got her the hot chocolate. I drove home. I didn't say a word. But that night, I called my attorney again, and I told him I wanted to move faster. Here is what I did. I want to be specific because I want you to understand that none of it was reckless. None of it was revenge for the sake of revenge. Every step I took was legal, documented, and done with the help of professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. First, I listed the house. I know how that sounds. Let me explain. My attorney connected me with a realtor he trusted. A woman who had handled several estate situations and understood discretion. We met at her office, not at my house. I gave her a complete picture of the property and told her what I was looking for. We agreed on a listing price, a timeline, and a process. The listing went live on a Thursday, while Preston was in Chicago for a work conference and Laurel had taken Poppy to her mother's for a long weekend. I had the house to myself for 4 days. It was the first time in 2 months I'd had the house to myself. And I spent those 4 days doing things with great deliberateness. I went through my files. I organized what needed to be organized. I moved certain documents and certain items to my attorney's office for safekeeping. I had a long conversation with Poppy's school about her enrollment and her records, a conversation that I was legally entitled to have as their grandfather of record, and I made a call to a family law attorney my attorney recommended, a woman who specialized in custody and grandparent rights. She walked me through the landscape carefully. She told me things I needed to hear and a few things I didn't want to hear but had to know anyway. You can't take action preemptively in most states without a triggering event, she told me. But if they relocate and there's a disruption to the child's stability, and if there's a documented history of the child's primary emotional bonds, that matters. Document everything. I started documenting. Preston came home from Chicago on a Sunday night. He walked in and set his bag down and looked around the living room the way you look around a room when something feels different but you can't identify what. "Have you been moving furniture?" he asked. "Just cleaning," I said. He nodded and went to the kitchen. I watched him open the refrigerator and stand there looking into it the way he has done since he was 12 years old, like something new might appear if he stares long enough. "Dad," he said, still facing the refrigerator. "Oh, Laurel and I have been thinking about the future, yours and ours." He closed the refrigerator and turned around. He had rehearsed this. I could tell by the way his shoulders were set. "We want to talk to you about maybe formalizing some things. The house, the finances, just so everything is organized." "That sounds reasonable," I said. He looked surprised. He had expected more resistance. "Yeah, sure. Why don't we sit down this week?" He relaxed visibly. "Great. Yeah, I'll have Laurel set something up." I went to bed that night, and I slept better than I had in weeks. The showing requests started coming in 4 days after listing. My realtor called me each time. I approved each showing for times when Preston was at work and Poppy was at school. Laurel was home more often, which was the complication, so we worked around her schedule carefully. The realtor was patient and professional, and never once made me feel foolish for the situation I was in. We had 3 serious offers within 10 days. I accepted one, below asking, but clean, no contingencies, buyers who could close in 30 days and meant it. My attorney drew up the paperwork. We scheduled the closing for a Friday 5 weeks out. I told no one. The meeting Preston and Laurel wanted to have about the future happened on a Wednesday evening. Laurel had made a dinner she clearly found impressive. Some kind of glazed salmon with vegetables arranged in a way that telegraphed effort. Poppy ate quietly and told me about a book she was reading. I listened to her describe the plot, and I thought, whatever happens, she is going to be fine. She has her grandmother's resilience. After Poppy went to bed, Laurel brought out a folder. I recognized the maneuver immediately. The folder was a performance. It said, "We are organized. We have thought about this. We are doing you a favor." Inside were printouts about senior living communities, 4 of them. Glossy pages, highlighted amenities, pricing information. "We've done a lot of research," Laurel said. "I can see that," I said. Preston had his hands flat on the table. "Dad, the house is bigger than you need. And the upkeep. We worry about you managing it alone. If we were to sell and pull the proceeds, pull them how?" I asked. He glanced at Laurel. "We've looked at some properties. A smaller place for you, something manageable. And we'd use part of the equity to—" "To what?" Laurel smiled. It was a smile I had seen her use at dinner parties when someone asked a question she found slightly beneath her. "To get ourselves into a better position, financially. We've been stretched thin with the renovations, and this would let everyone start fresh." I looked at them both for a moment, at the folder, at the salmon, still on the table in its glaze. "I appreciate you thinking about me," I said. Of course, Preston said. He was relieved again. He kept making that mistake. Let me think about it. The closing was on a Friday in March, a cold, bright day. I drove to the title company's office alone. I sat across from the buyers, a couple in their early 40s, moving from out of state. The wife was pregnant with their second, and I signed everything I needed to sign. The title agent was efficient and kind. The whole thing took 40 minutes. I walked out with a cashier's check for $12,000. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a while. Not because I was sad exactly. The house had been my wife's idea. The hydrangeas and the particular shade of yellow she'd painted the front door, and the way the morning light came through the kitchen window. Leaving it was hard. I won't pretend otherwise, but I had made arrangements. My attorney had helped me put the proceeds into a structure that would be very difficult for anyone to access without my direct authorization. A portion had already been moved into Poppy's trust, which she would receive at 25, enough to change her life, but late enough that she'd have some sense by then. The rest I was still deciding. I had already rented an apartment, a smaller place in a building close to Poppy's school, a 10-minute drive from her soccer fields. It had a second bedroom that I planned to furnish with a record player and a good reading lamp. I drove to a diner I like, and I had a cheeseburger and a piece of pie, and I read the newspaper like a human being with nowhere to be. I called Preston that evening. Hey, he said. He sounded distracted. The background noise told me he was watching something on television. I have some news, I said. I sold the house. A pause. I'm sorry. What? I sold the house. Closed today. The buyers are moving in at the end of the month, so you'll need to make arrangements before then. I'd say 3 weeks to be comfortable. The television went quiet. I heard Laurel's voice in the background asking something. Dad. His voice had changed. Dad, what are you? You can't just... We were going to talk about this. We did talk about it, I said, last Wednesday, and I said I'd think about it. I thought about it. That's not what that conversation was. Preston, the house has always been mine. I've never suggested otherwise. You've been my guests, which I've been glad of. But the decision about the house was mine to make. I heard him tell Laurel. I heard her say something short and sharp. Then there was a sound I won't describe, except to say it was not quiet. Where are we supposed to go? Preston said. He was trying to stay calm and not entirely succeeding. You have an apartment, I said. You've been renting it out while you stayed with me. It's yours. The tenant's lease doesn't end for 6 weeks. Then you have a hotel situation to solve, which I'm sorry about, but that's a separate matter from the house. Dad, I found myself a place. I'm very comfortable. I'd like Poppy to visit whenever her schedule allows. I let that land. He understood what it meant, or he would once he'd had time to think about it with less adrenaline running through him. You can't use Poppy as... I'm not using Poppy for anything. I'm telling you I love my granddaughter and I intend to stay in her life. All other decisions are between you and me and whatever attorney you choose to hire. But I have documentation of this living arrangement, this conversation, and a number of other things that I think any reasonable person would find clarifying. I'd encourage you to talk to someone before you decide how to proceed. Silence. The realtor will be in touch about the logistics of the move out. There's a contact number in the email I just sent you. I hung up. It has been 4 months since that phone call. Preston and Laurel are back in their apartment. The renovation, which I have come to understand was largely fictional in terms of its timeline, concluded shortly after they had no choice but to return. I don't know the details of their financial situation, and I don't ask. What I know is that Poppy comes to my apartment every other Saturday. She puts on whatever record she feels like. We make grilled cheese and we talk about her week. She is doing a project on bridges for her 4th grade class, and she asked me to help her, which I have been doing with more enthusiasm than is probably dignified for a man my age. Last Saturday, She looked up from her poster board and said, "Grandpa, how do you know if a bridge is strong enough?" "You test it," I said. "You apply pressure and you see what holds." She nodded very seriously and went back to drawing. Outside, the March light was coming through the window at a low angle. It looked a little like the kitchen window at the old house. Not exactly, but a little. I poured myself a second cup of coffee. I watched my granddaughter draw a suspension bridge with careful, deliberate lines. She has her grandmother's hands, the same focus. I didn't need 900,000 square feet of history and hydrangeas to be a father. I needed to still be standing. I'm still standing. I've been thinking about what I would tell Preston if he ever asked me honestly why I did it the way I did. Not why I sold the house. I think he understands that part now, even if he won't admit it. But why I didn't warn him, why I let it get as far as it got before I moved. The honest answer is that I needed to be sure. Not about them. I was sure about them the moment I heard Laurel say the words memory care facility in my own dining room. I needed to be sure about myself, about whether I was the kind of man who still had the steadiness to act carefully when everything in him wanted to react loudly. That's the thing nobody tells you about getting older. The world starts treating your silence as confusion. They see a man who doesn't argue, and they decide he can't. Preston watched me let 100 small things go over 2 months, and he interpreted that patience as weakness. He was wrong, but I understand why he made that mistake. I had made it easy for him to make it. There's a cost to being easygoing. I don't mean you should be difficult. I've known difficult men, and they die surrounded by people who are relieved to go home. What I mean is that when you spend decades absorbing things quietly, the people who benefit from that start to believe the absorbing is permanent. They stop checking whether it has limits. They stop wondering what happens when those limits are reached. Preston stopped wondering. That was his real mistake. Not the greed, I can understand, even forgive, eventually, but the certainty. The way he sat across from me with that folder and those glossy brochures and explained my own life back to me like I was a problem to be managed. He had already written the ending in his head and cast me in a role I had never agreed to play. What I did, the calls, the attorney, the listing, the closing, none of it required extraordinary intelligence. It required only that I pay attention, move deliberately, and refuse to become what they had already decided I was. That's not wisdom, exactly. It's closer to stubbornness with good paperwork. But here is the part I keep coming back to, Poppy. She's 9 years old, and she asked me whether Grandpa's house was going to become their house. She asked it the way children ask things, without cruelty, just wanting to know the shape of the world. And I thought, if I do nothing, that's the shape of the world she grows up in. A world where you take from the people who loved you first and call it practical. I'm not interested in raising her in that world. I'm not interested in being its example. The choices we make when we think no one important is watching. Those are the choices that actually form the people around us. Preston watched me for 44 years. I don't know entirely what he learned. But Poppy is still watching. And every Saturday when she comes to my apartment and puts on a record and draws her bridges with those careful, deliberate lines, I think, this is what I can still do. I can show her what it looks like to hold your ground without losing your decency, to be taken advantage of and still not become bitter. To lose a house and not lose yourself. I sold 900 square feet of memory and hydrangeas. I kept everything that mattered. That's the only math I'm interested in at 67.